Dear Lord, baby Jesus, or as our brothers to the south call you, Jesus, we thank you so much for this bountiful harvest of Domino's, KFC, and it always.
Now we're going to start learning about the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was called this because this was a time period when a lot of forward thinking started to take place. People started thinking outside the box. The United States was kind of staying stagnant. It wasn't really going anywhere. And progressives wanted to see this change. The biggest way that change was going to happen was it was going to have to come from within. It was going to have to start within our government, and then once change started to happen with our government, it could kind of permeate out and work out into society. So the whole aim of the Progressive Era was to fix politics and society.
And progressives, yes. You know, like these guys who used to want to bomb the means of production, but also less radical progressives. Mr. Green, are we talking about like Tumblr progressives where it's half discussions of misogyny and half high contrast images of pizza? Because if so, I can get behind that. Me from the past, your anachronism is showing your internet was green letters on a black screen. But no, the progressive era was not like Tumblr. However, I will argue that it did indirectly make Tumblr and therefore JLog gift sets possible, so that's something. So some of the solutions that progressives came up with to deal with issues of inequality and injustice don't seem terribly progressive today, and also it kind of overlapped with the Gilded Age, and progressive implies like progress, presumably progress toward freedom and justice, which is hard to argue about an era that involved one of the great restrictions of freedom in American history, prohibition. So maybe we shouldn't call it the progressive era at all. Stan, whatever, roll the intro. So if the Gilded Age was the period when American industrial capitalism came into its own and people like Mark Twain began to criticize its associated problems, then the Progressive Era was the age in which people actually tried to solve those problems through individual and group action. As the economy changed, progressives also had to respond to a rapidly changing political system. The population of the US was growing and its economic power was becoming ever more concentrated, and sometimes progressives responded to this by opening up political participation, and sometimes by trying to restrict the vote. The thing is, broad participatory democracy doesn't always result in effective government, he said, sounding like the Chinese National Communist Party. And that tension between wanting to have government for, of, and by the people and wanting to have government that's like good at governing kind of defined the progressive era, and also our era. But progressives were most concerned with the social problems that revolved around industrial capitalist society, and most of these problems weren't new by 1900, but some of the responses were. Companies, and later corporations, had a problem that had been around at least since the 1880s. They needed to keep costs down and profits high in a competitive market, and one of the best ways to do this was to keep wages low, hours long, and conditions appalling. Your basic house elf situation. Just kidding, house elves didn't get wages. Also, by the end of the 19th century, people started to feel like these large monopolistic industrial combinations, the so-called trusts, were exerting too much power over people's lives. The 1890s saw federal attempts to deal with these trusts, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, but overall, the federal government wasn't where most progressive changes were made. For instance, there was muckraking, a form of journalism in which reporters would find some muck and rake it. Mass circulation magazines realized they could make money by publishing exposés of industrial and political abuse, so they did. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? I bet it involves muck. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either correct or I get shocked. Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, and all the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid one by one. Of the butchers and floormen, the beef boners and trimmers, and all those who used knives, you could scarcely find a person who had the use of his thumb. Time and time again, the base of it had been slashed, till it was a mere lump of flesh against which the man pressed the knife to hold it. They would have no nails. They had worn them off, pulling hides. Wow. Well, now I am hyper aware of and grateful for my thumbs. They are just in excellent shape. I am so glad, Stan, that I am not a beef boner at one of the meat packing factories written about in the jungle by Upton Sinclair. No shock for me! Oh, Stan, I can only imagine how long and hard you've worked to get the phrase beef boner into this show, and you finally did it. Congratulations! By the way, just a little bit of trivia. The Jungle was the first book I ever read that made me vomit. So that's a review. I don't know if it's positive, but there you go. Anyway, at the time, readers of The Jungle were more outraged by descriptions of rotten meat than by the treatment of meatpacking workers. The Jungle led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. That's pretty cool for Upton Sinclair, although my books have also led to some federal legislation, such as the which officially declared Hazel and Augustus the nation's OTP. So to be fair, writers have been describing the harshness of industrial capitalism for decades, so muckraking wasn't really that new, but the use of photography for documentation was. Lewis Hine, for instance, photographed child laborers in factories and mines, bringing Americans face to face with the more than 2 million children under the age of 15 working for wages, and Hine's photos helped bring about laws that limited child labor. But even more important than the writing and photographs in magazines when it came to improving conditions for workers was Twitter. What's that? There was no Twitter? Still? What is this, 1812? Alright, so apparently still without Twitter, workers had to organize into unions to get corporations to reduce hours and raise their pay. Also, some employers started to realize on their own that one way to mitigate some of the problems of industrialization was to pay workers better. Like in 1914, Henry Ford paid his workers an average of $5 per day. Unheard of at the time. Whereas today I pay Stan and Danica 3 times that, and still they whine. Ford's reasoning was that better paid workers would be better able to afford the Model Ts that they were making, and indeed, Ford's annual output rose from 34,000 cars to 730,000 cars between 1910 and 1916, and the price of a Model T dropped from $700 to $316. Still, Henry Ford definitely forgot to be awesome sometimes. He was anti-Semitic, he used spies in his factory, and he named his child Edsel. Also, like most employers at the turn of the century, he was virulently anti-union. So while the AFL was organizing the most privileged industrial workers, another union grew up to advocate for rights for a larger swath of the workforce, especially the immigrants who dominated unskilled labor, the industrial workers of the world. They were also known as the Wobblies, and they were founded in 1905 to advocate for, quote, every wage worker, no matter what his religion, fatherland, or trade, and not, as the name Wobblies suggests, just those fans of wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey. The Wobblies were radical socialists. Ultimately, they wanted to see capitalism and the state disappear in revolution. Now, most progressives didn't go that far, but some, following the ideas of Henry George, worried that economic progress could produce a dangerous, unequal distribution of wealth that could only be cured by taxes. But more progressives were influenced by Simon W. Patton, who prophesied that industrialization would bring about a new civilization where everyone would benefit from the abundance and all the leisure time that all these new labor-saving devices could bring. This optimism was partly spurred by the birth of a mass consumption society. I mean, Americans by 1915 could purchase all kinds of newfangled devices like washing machines or vacuum cleaners, automobiles, record players. It's worth underscoring that all this happened in a couple generations. I mean, in 1850, almost everyone listened to music and washed their clothes in nearly the same way that people did 10,000 years ago. And then, boom. And for many progressives, this consumer culture, to quote our old friend Eric Foner, became the foundation for a new understanding of freedom, as access to the cornucopia of goods made available by modern capitalism. And this idea was encouraged by new advertising that connected goods with freedom, using liberty as a brand name, or affixing the Statue of Liberty to a product. By the way, crash courses made exclusively in the United States of America, the greatest nation on earth, ever. That's a lie, of course. But
So I'm going to stop that video right there. I want to get through and talk about the muckrakers. First of all, muckrakers, they were kind of like the early investigative reporters. Their job was to get in and just like take all this muck that's on the bottom and stir it up so that people can see it from the top. Here's the best analogy I have. Those of you that have ever been out to Willow Lake, especially if you've been on the west end of it, at times the west end of the lake can get pretty shallow. It might only get 2-3 feet deep. Let's say you're in your boat and you happen to run your boat aground. You just get in water that's too shallow. I think no big deal. I'll just get out. The water's only a couple feet deep. I'll get out and I'll just push it out. Or maybe you're with someone and the two of you are going to try to do that. Well, you get out of the boat, and the water may only be a couple feet deep, so you're thinking it's only going to come up to maybe just above your knees, maybe mid-thigh. Next thing you know, the water's up over your waist. Why is that? Because the water may only be a couple feet deep. However, the mud, the muck that's on the bottom is as deep as the water is. And so now you're in water up over your waist. From the surface, everything looks fine. You'd have no idea that it's like that down there. But when you get down in it and you stir it up and you bring it all to the surface, you realize that it's really kind of gross. Well, that was the same way with muckrakers. On the surface in society, people thought life in the United States was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. Everyone was really happy. But when these muckrakers kind of got in there and they kind of stirred all this stuff up and they brought it to the surface, people in America were just absolutely appalled at what it was that was going on, how some people were forced to live their lives. And that's when these issues started to be focused on. The muckrakers we're going to focus on here. First, there's Ida Tarbell. Standard Oil. Standard Oil was run by John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil at one time controlled 80% of all oil production in the United States. They owned the oil rigs that brought the oil to the surface. They owned the land the oil rigs sat on. They owned the refineries where the oil was taken to be turned into the oil that was going to be used. They owned the gas stations where the oil was sold, where the gas was sold. And Rockefeller was a very crude businessman. Let's say that someone had their own individual gas station. It just happened to be located in a town where Standard Oil had one. Rockefeller would send someone to, he wanted to buy that station. He didn't like the competition. He'd go there and he'd offer a decent sum of money, but the person realized in the long run they could make more money if they just stayed in business than if they took Rockefeller's money for the purchase. And so they would respectfully decline, and then next thing you know, a couple days later, boom, there's a fire, place burns down. Rockefeller's guy shows up again and he's like, oh, sorry about what happened. We're still interested in buying this, but you see, now we would have to go in and we have to rebuild everything. And so instead of being able to offer you this amount, we're going to have to offer you this much lesser amount. Well, you really don't have a choice now. Odds are you don't have insurance. Insurance was something that didn't really exist back then. And so you probably you didn't have enough money put away to rebuild. Now you have no option but to sell what you have, your land, for a fraction of what you originally could have gotten. And now Rockefeller's just going to make more money. Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities, exposing the connection between big business and government. Oftentimes what would happen is businesses would cut corners here and there so that they could save as much money as they could. And government allowed them to do this in a number of ways. And for most people, they were completely unaware of it until Steffens started to write about it. And people could not believe how government was doing favors for big business. Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Lives. When individuals would come to the United States, it would cost them every cent they had. And when they got here, they thought, I'm going to go to the cities because that's where all the jobs are. If there weren't jobs there, why would so many people be living there? When they got there, they realized the reason why so many people are there because they had the exact same ideas that these people did. Problem is, they got to the city using every last cent they had. Now that they're there, they can't afford to go anyplace else. The other thing is, they wanted to live in a place where there was someone already like them. People of the same nationality that looked the same, that dressed the same, that spoke the same language, that ate the same food. It was more comforting to them. Problem is, there wasn't any work for anyone for jobs for anyone to have. Okay, I'm going to stop this here. There's going to be this is part 1 of chapter 13, section 1. You're going to have to watch part 2 of chapter 13, section 1.